Hi. If you've been following along with us, you know that one of the things that we've really been hammering home in terms of topics is the development of American political thought. And we're going to continue on with that issue here today. And we're really going to stress this with respect to the philosophical roots of not only the American Revolution, but also, things that are deeply embedded in American political consciousness. Right? The idea of freedom, equality, and the fact that you should have some say in the small d democratic process. Okay. So without further ado, I would like to begin, like so many other things in this class, begin in Europe, because one of the things that you're seeing happening toward the end of the medieval time period is the emergence of an intellectual movement referred to as the Enlightenment. Okay. Now, for your notes, what the Enlightenment is quite similar to the Renaissance. It's the rebirth of something. I always like to think of the Enlightenment as the rebirth of thinking, the rebirth of learning. For over 1,000 years, Europe had been in the Dark Ages, the medieval time period, and so the primary focus was on survival on a day-to-day basis. This is going to change as Europe becomes increasingly stable and food becomes more readily available and politics become more and more entrenched in the European continent, okay? And so, of course, you've got individuals like Copernicus, for instance, who is commissioned to study the universe by the Catholic Church, and all the while that he's publishing during his life about how Earth is the center of the universe, and therefore it's reinforcing the Catholic notion that God made man in his own like image. Upon his deathbed, he publishes his actual findings, and his actual findings illuminate the idea that it's the sun, not the earth, that is the center of the universe. So people like Copernicus would be a good example of this concept of the rebirth of thinking. Okay. Now, obviously, there are connections to the pure sciences, but I also want you to be mindful that there are connections to what you call the social sciences too. I'm talking about things like political science, sociology. You could make a case for history, although I doubt historians themselves thought of themselves as social scientists back during this time period. But the individual that I need you to have in your notes to that end is an English philosopher by the name of John Locke. Now, John Locke, he's the guy, and we've talked about him in a little way, especially in the context of the Glorious Revolution. John Locke is the guy that develops this notion that governments derive their power from the people that they govern. Now, the reason that this is such a radical notion, it's going back to the same reason that Copernicus made this radical notion, observation. For over 1,000 years, nobody had questioned the rule and the authority of the king or the queen, just like nobody had a challenge the authority of the Pope with the Catholic Church. So, as Europe becomes increasingly stable, and people like John Locke are able to read those classic Greco-Roman works, people like Aristotle, Plato, what they begin to rediscover is this, antiquity world that there were various forms of democracy. And so one of the things that John Locke comes up with is if you are going to rule, then you need the consent of the people. And if the people do not consent, then that does not make your rule legitimate. So for laws, for taxes, for decisions to be made by a governmental body, they need the consent of the people. So what I need you to understand about John Locke is it has a monumental impact upon the American colonists. This is not just something that's happening in Europe in a vacuum. I mean, every one of our quote-unquote founding fathers carried around pamphlets that John Locke wrote in the front pocket of their jacket. So it has a deeply profound impact on the American colonies. Okay. Now, if you wanted an American representative of the Enlightenment, then look no further than Benjamin Franklin. Now, on a very basic level, Franklin was an individual that wanted to understand things on a very fundamental level, and he wanted to understand them on a level that was deeper than, the Puritan explanation for why lightning crashed, for instance. So one of the things that Benjamin Franklin is famous for is his kite experiment. And it's during that kite experiment that Franklin ultimately discovers that lightning's really electricity. And you can conduct electricity if you expose it to things like metals, specific kinds of metals. Of course, some of you are aware that when he flew this kite in the lightning storm, he attached a key to it and he demonstrated. Actually, it wasn't him that demonstrated. He had somebody else demonstrate for him that that you could harness electricity. Okay. So what Benjamin Franklin's doing, in addition to using logic and reason to explain the world that he saw around him, he's also he's also thinking critically about the social and political world that he sees all around him. And so, while he's a scientist in the traditional sense, he's also commentating on society at large and governments and where they get their power from, and he's making all of this public through his publications, okay? So he's providing a secular, non-religious aspect to colonial life, which is loosening the control of institutions like the Puritan Church, and at the same time, he's really fostering this notion of American political thought, questioning why the world is the way that it is, why rulers have power, and that power seems to be almost absolute, and while people like him have to simply not ask questions and fall in line. Okay. Now, speaking of a more secular aspect of colonial society, I want us to spend just a moment on the deists. Now, what was deism? Who was a deist? Well, deism is, again, this intellectual movement that begins to sweep across the Western world. And what the deists believe, they're not atheists. I don't want you to get the idea that they don't believe in God whatsoever. They just, they don't believe in the same kind of God that some of your more conservative Protestant sects would. Okay, I mean, the deists, for example, believe that there is a higher power than mankind, but they're not entirely sure what that power consists of. It could be the Puritan God, or it could be something as simple as Mother Nature. So deists and deism differed from Judeo-Christian thought in the sense that the deists believed that not only were people good, they were born good, you could improve them. You could improve them through things like logic and reason. You could do things like enhance their life while they were on Earth by providing things like public education. I mean, one of the most famous deists in American life at the time was Thomas Jefferson. And not only was Jefferson, like Franklin, an individual that was continuously asking the question why, he was a deep, deep believer in the institution that would become public higher learning. He goes on to found a very important public university that would ultimately become the University of Virginia, one of the best public universities in the world. And you know, it was Jefferson that believed that you have a right to an education, and you know, simply the lack of funds or economic resources should not dictate whether or not you can have access to that. Okay. So again, the deists are not only providing a secular element to American life, they're also deeply rooting this notion of American political thought in the sense that they are asking the question why, and they're loosening those traditional sources and origins of control, including things like the Puritan Church. Okay. Now, speaking of religiosity, there is another movement that's going to be sweeping across the American colonies in due time, and that would be the movement called Pietism. Now, for your notes, Pietism is, I always like to think of it as a much more democratic version of Christianity, okay? If you think about an institution like the Catholic Church, not only was that very hierarchical, right? In other words, you had the Pope, and then you had the cardinals and the bishops, and so on and so forth. It was also an institution that emphasized that the common person, the common Catholic, did not have a direct relationship, a direct line of communication with their Creator. I mean, the whole the whole purpose of the institution of the papacy was God's representation on earth. And God, if you happen to be Catholic, works through the Pope. Okay? So Pietism comes along, and what it emphasizes is that you don't need to be well-born. You don't need to be Pope or Bishop. If you're English, you don't have to be the head of the Anglican Church. You don't have to be king or queen to have a relationship with your Creator. Not only could you have an opinion on Christianity, generally speaking, but God would work through you too. God touched you too. God cared about you too. In that respect, it's very different. It's unconventional if you compare it to things like Catholicism or the Puritan Church. Okay? So how did it get over here? How did it get from Central Europe to the Americas? Well, like so many other things, including enlightenment thought, it's getting there through immigrants that are going over to the New World. And one of those immigrants is a guy by the name of Theodore Jacob Frelinghuysen, right? He's this European immigrant that really plants the seed that would become Pietism in the North American colonies. But it's Jonathan Edwards, a pastor and philosopher, that really develops the fire and brimstone style of preaching that would come to really represent Pietism over the course of the Great Awakening. Okay? Now, I included in your reading for your Big Green Book this week a sermon, entitled Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And really what Edwards is doing is developing this notion of fire and brimstone kind of preaching, very electric kind of atmosphere, but emphasizing that, hell was a real place. And God, if you don't accept him into your life, very well could not be pleased with you. And so therefore, what we see happen here are these really enthusiastic reactions at these religious revivals in which Edwards is preaching. Now, one of the individuals that really takes this to the next level is another pastor, a guy by the name of George Whitefield, who conducts a series of religious revivals all across the colonies that come to be known as the Great Awakening. Okay? Now, the Great Awakening were a series of these religious revivals, and it's taking the Edwards style of preaching and philosophy and inserting it into these revivals. And you would have people passing out, and the pastors would explain it was the Spirit touching them, or they would be speaking in these unrecognizable languages. And again, the leaders would explain that that was a language that only God could understand, but nonetheless, it was God working through your common man. In other words, this is not the head of the Puritan Church. It's not the head of the Catholic Church. This is just your average colonial individual. Now, the other thing that I want you to be mindful of as it relates to the Great Awakening is this has an unmistakable impact on social relations, both in the North as well as in the South. Okay? If you were a believer in this new wave of religiosity, generally speaking Pietism, you were referred to as a new light, right? And if you were much more of the conservative variety, you were a Puritan, you were a Catholic, you didn't like the change all that much, you were an old light. And it's going to be the struggle between the new lights and the old lights to really hang on to that position of authority in American colonial life. Well, one of the things that these new lights begin doing is they begin establishing these separatist churches. Now again, I'm referring to the North right now. So you've got your Presbyterians, and you've got some of your other individuals that are separating from your traditional Protestant sects in the North. And the thing of it is that they're very easy to dismiss initially, but over the course of time, what they begin doing is setting up these learning centers, these religious learning centers. Now, first of all, this practice, setting up a religious learning center, it was nothing new. I mean, Oxford, Bologna, Paris, Cambridge, all of those famous, prestigious European universities got their start as cathedral schools where people who wanted to become priests eventually were sent to learn things like Latin or religious doctrine. Well, the same thing begins to happen over here in the aftermath of the Great Awakening. These series of religious revivals emerge into what you can think of as a religious community of ideas. And that's really where Harvard University traces its roots back to. I mean, Harvard initially was a seminary school, and over the course of time, it began to branch out into other realms of philosophy, and even later still, it began to branch out into what you think of as a traditional institution of higher education, studying the professions, studying medicine, studying law, studying things that have a practical use in everyday American life. And as that begins to happen, there are other people that worry that when Harvard loses its way, there needs to be something that brings it back and reins it back in. So the good people in New Haven, Connecticut thought that Harvard needed to be reined in, and so they established what would later become Yale University. And Yale is specifically designed to challenge Harvard as a competitive or competitor institution, especially as it relates to religious learning. Okay, so this rivalry between Harvard and Yale, it's much, much older than we traditionally think. It's much older than college football. Let me just put it that way. Okay, so what I want you to understand about the religious revivals in the North is they're deeply challenging the social order as it had been established early on in colonial history. I mean, the social order in places like Massachusetts was the Puritan Church, and nobody really questioned that. In the aftermath of the religious revivals, what you see is the Puritan Church's grip beginning to loosen in that part of the country. Now, the impact on the South is probably even more dramatic, okay? You've got your Methodists and you've got your Baptists, and what they're doing is similar to the people in the North. They're establishing these new Protestant sects, churches. Only there's a really important twist, especially with people like the Baptists. They're emphasizing the golden rule. Treat others as you'd like to be treated. Think about this for a second. In a place like Virginia, in a place like South Carolina, is this dangerous? Is there an institution that, the golden rule kind of systemically, makes hypocritical? For my money, that would be slavery. I mean, how can you justify slavery and practice the golden rule at the same time? It's impossible, right? So the established order of the Anglican Church, which was the dominant form of religion in a place like Virginia, was very, very leery of, these new wave Protestant sects. But what made them even more suspicious, and hostile really is what you mean, is the Baptist practice of inviting African Americans into their congregations to worship alongside of them. So if you think about this, you've got working class white people next to working class enslaved Africans and African Americans, and they're not only under the same roof, they're judging the same society. And as Frederick Douglass points out, slavery is an institution that victimizes basically everybody that it touches, including the slave owners themselves. I mean, he's pretty quick to note the perversion of Christianity with respect to an individual like Sophia Auld. So what the authorities in places like Virginia and South Carolina do is they ban the Baptist faith, and they drive it underground. And if you've ever driven through basically anywhere in Texas, or the South generally speaking, you know that they did not do a very good job, because, throw a stone in any one direction in the South, and you're probably going to have a pretty good chance of hitting a Baptist church. Now, I'm oversimplifying it, but you get the point. Baptism, Methodism, it spreads like wildfire across the South. So, if the established order cannot beat it, in other words, they can't just drive it out of existence, they need to find a way to accommodate it. And so that's what you're seeing in a text like Frederick Douglass, when Master Hugh Auld, the husband of Sophia Auld, catches his wife teaching Douglass how to read the Bible. He strictly forbids it and explains to her, look, there's not going to be any good that can come from this. Now, to be sure, there were a lot of slave owners that preached the Bible to their slave populations and read Scripture, but they were extremely careful to select which passages they read to them. In other words, that whole part of Moses leading his people out of the desert, they conveniently forgot to mention that part. So you can see what I'm talking about here in the sense that the Great Awakening in the South is very, very consequential when it comes to establishing, challenging the established religious and social order. But at the same time, the social order found a way to reinvent itself to accommodate this new development in American religious life, and ultimately, at least in the white community, became an apologist institution for the institution that was slavery. So by the time that we get to the 19th century and we see the emergence of the Second Great Awakening, it's really going to be an important development that you have not only the second religious awakening, you also see the establishment of the African American churches. And whether you're talking about the abolitionist movement of the 19th century or the civil rights movement of the 20th century, the black churches are going to be paramount when it comes to getting things done. So, I need you to kind of summarize what we've been learning here. Whether you're talking about the Enlightenment, Lacanian theory, Deism, Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson trying to explain the world that they saw around them, or whether you're talking about Pietism, a much more democratic form of religion, you are really talking about things that are deeply influential when it comes to American political thought. If you take nothing else away from this other than this, what I want to leave you with is an individual like John Locke can probably be considered a father of American political thought, not only in the sense that pretty much all of our founding fathers read Locke and admired his work very much, but one of the things that we continuously go back to in the 1760s and 70s is no taxation without representation. And that's strictly, well, maybe not strictly, but certainly fundamentally Lacanian theory, in the sense that if you're going to pass a law like a tax, you should have the consent of the people. And considering you haven't gotten the consent of the American colonists, you haven't given us any representation in Parliament, how can you say that that's a legitimate law? So anyway, I hope that makes sense, and I hope that you use this to prepare for your midterm exam.